Now to Russia and the oligarch stripped of his liberty and multi-billion-dollar oil company by President Vladimir Putin, who believes Russia is nearing an economic crisis that could lead to an uprising. Mikhail Khodorkovsky fell foul of Putin when he began meddling in politics. In the end, he spent a decade in prison after being found guilty of tax evasion. Patricia Sabga from Al Jazeera America sat down with Khodorkovsky and asked him whether, given all that's transpired in Ukraine, if he thinks the West has underestimated President Putin.
I doubt that anybody in the West today underestimates Putin. I think that if anything, he's being overestimated because he's being compared to the current leaders of their countries. And none of these leaders have lately manifested any brilliant strategic thinking.
You've said in several interviews is that Putin and Russia could be facing or are vulnerable to a 1917-like moment. Can you explain for our audience exactly what you mean by that?
In 1917, Russia was at a stage where it was seeking victory in the First World War. But at that point, the power had lost authority with the people. And as a result, the people were intolerant of even the slightest mistakes that the power would make. They lacked trust in the authorities, and the reason they lacked the trust was because the authorities were totally corrupt. And as a result of a small temporary shortage of bread deliveries in St. Petersburg, this little incident blew up into a revolution and ultimately even a civil war.
Do Western sanctions make that scenario more or less likely?
Less likely, of course. In 1917, or actually more precisely in 1918, Russian society united in the face of an external threat. Not entirely, but to a significant degree, it did unite. Today, the West is doing much the same thing. The way Russian people perceive it, the West is punishing Russia for daring to pursue an independent foreign policy.
So if not sanctions, then what can the West do to at least encourage some reform in Russia?
For Soviet society, and I do mean Soviet, the West was always important as a model of moral behavior. Soviet people wanted very much for our society to be built differently, more fairly, for human value, or for the value of human life to be higher, for our leaders to be more moral. The more advanced segment of the Soviet population saw this example in the West. This was a significant part of the problem, right up there with making sure that the grocery store shelves were filled with goods. Today, the shops are filled with goods both here and there. But the moral example over the past 20 years has become very blurred. I think it would be useful for the West, not only for Russia's sake, but even for its own sake, to move back a little bit to that previous situation. And of course, to tell the Russian people about this.
What should the West be more concerned about? A crisis outside of Russia, Russian aggression, or a crisis inside Russia?
But you can see that these two are totally interconnected. Putin's aggression outside of Russia creates a situation in Russia where the national chauvinists are on the rise, and that is bringing things closer to a crisis. Seeing his popularity falling in Russia and seeing the rise of the national chauvinists, Putin attempts to take over their agenda for himself by means of external aggression. So the situation is certainly interconnected, and to my great regret, I think we have stepped onto a path of no return. As a result of this, of taking this path, the regime in Russia will be destroyed. What sorts of losses this will bring to Russia and to the whole world is something we all have yet to see.
You are a dissident, but you're also an ex-oligarch, which is a rather hated class in Russia. So how can you convince them? Do you think you can be a legitimate engager, if you will?
I'm not a dissident. and I'm certainly not an oligarch anymore.
Диссиденты — это те
Dissidents are people who serve an idea and who find the notion of compromise impossible.
какие-то компромиссы.
I believe that compromise is also an idea.
Олигархи —
A person who has spent 10 years in jail is not an oligarch. So I think I do have some opportunities. They have their limits, of
не
course.
безграничны.
You've been asked about your past role as an oligarch, and you have said that mistakes have been made and that your values have changed. But do you think that you need to publicly atone more for your past actions to gain that legitimacy with reform-minded people in Russia?
Я говорил
I have told my fellow citizens numerous times that one may have made mistakes, but I feel it more important to move on rather than dwell on the past. Repentance is a personal thing. It's not a public thing. If somebody wants a public act of repentance, let them await it from Putin. Those who want to move ahead and do something and make change, I want to work with them.